Hey, Cypher here, coming at you with a pretty quickly put together video. I've been getting numerous requests to make a video talking about the current crisis that we're facing, like the pandemic right now, and like the Spanish flu from a century ago. So understandably, people look to the past for historical precedent to reassure themselves of what the future holds. Or at least the consolation of saying, well, it ain't that bad. But I don't think I can really do either of those justice. Honestly, I don't exactly know how to look at all this craziness myself. Obviously, it isn't as bad as a century ago. I don't think any intelligent observer could say otherwise. Yeah, right, dude. 2020 is way worse than 1920. You don't know what you're talking about. Look here, it's the cynical straw man, crypto. Bruh. The world is ending, and you're just a puppet for their propaganda. We gotta go out and buy as much toilet paper as we possibly can. Okay, calm down. It isn't that bad. We've seen people panic buying and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, but crypto here is acting crazy and causing the craziness, not out of a good reaction, but through ignorance. Who are you calling ignorant? The fact is, historians, just like everybody else, tend to freak out in the present.
Come on, baby, what the—
Historical precedent. We've never seen this before.
Could this be the end of the world?
But when we finally have sufficient hindsight, we see that this wasn't only predictable, but kinda mundane. You don't know how bad it'll get. They aren't even telling us the truth. Are you seriously trying to tell us that everything's gonna be fine? You're just a historian, if I'm willing to give you that. Okay, look, I can't say that right now, obviously. I don't have sufficient hindsight. So crypto, you are right in that regard. Well, it's about time I get some credit around here. But knowing that that hindsight is coming, I often find myself playing the moderating voice.
75 years later.
Where have I seen this before? Here it is.
And I can say for sure, the sun will rise tomorrow. Nonetheless, there are some striking parallels to the 19-teens and 20s to where we are with the 20-teens and 2020s. And looking at them may give us some very necessary perspective. It's morally ambiguous, as all history is, but maybe we can learn a little bit by looking at today's parallels from a century ago. I put up on Twitter and Facebook a version of this little list, and I just want to talk about what these parallels might mean. So first is just the idea of the Roaring '20s. You know, we look at the 20s as a pretty good time for the United States. The economy was booming, and it was the age of jazz and speakeasies, and woo, what a fun time, at least until the Great Depression. But actually, there were some significant problems at the beginning of the 1920s at least. And the first of those was what's called the nadir of race relations. As in, Jim Crow was basically fully implemented in the South and actually in a lot of other places. Black disenfranchisement was all over the place, and far worse than it had been in the 1880s. Also, in 1919, there were more lynchings that year than any other year in the United States. Plus that year had Red Summer, which was a series of race riots that were almost the equivalent of race massacres. And there would be continuous problems all the way into the 1920s. In fact, one of the worst of these was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where there were airplanes literally dropping dynamite on people just because they were of a different skin tone. The Tulsa riot is more aptly named the Tulsa Massacre because, yeah, white people really did massacre black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. That was terrible. And we're not seeing anything anywhere close to that now. There is no parallel to that. Sure, we definitely have some race problems. For instance, how we're treating detainees at the border is somewhat abhorrent. But it's nothing like having mass lynchings. But there is a significant parallel to 1919 and 1920 to today, and that's on the idea of progress, because Woodrow Wilson was president in 1919 and 1920.
Wilson!
Now, I would never say that this president is as bad as Wilson. I don't think this president is particularly capable of being as bad as Wilson. But I don't think anybody in their right mind is going to say that he's been a good president either. And Wilson really represents the end of progressivism. And we'll see, but maybe Trump is the end of progressivism in the early 21st century. But yeah, one terrible president in 1920, I'd say the worst, and a pretty terrible president in 2020. That's a pretty significant parallel, especially when you're looking at how they both treated progressivism. The next check mark is global war. Now, obviously, we're not in a world war, although that was trending on Twitter earlier this year, though I'm pretty sure everybody who used that hashtag has no idea what a world war is. But we are in a global war on terror. Yeah, the global war on terror is a global war. One could say a world war. And it's all over the place, from Western Africa all the way to the Philippines. But there are significant differences. We don't have a draft. We don't have the Espionage and Sedition Acts. We don't have an entire war economy. But then again, we have significant federal funding into a military-industrial complex. And we also have, like, the Patriot Act, which has a lot of the same problems that the Sedition Act had. And although World War I ended in 1918, there were still conflicts ongoing all the way into the 1920s. For instance, there was the Allied intervention into the Russian Civil War, which continued all the way until 1920, and for the Japanese, it continued until 1922. So today, we have troops still in Afghanistan, still in Iraq, some in Syria, some all over the place. We have troops all over the world. So while we're definitely in a lesser form of global war than back in 1920, the one today is still all-pervasive. The next checkmark is Postponed Olympics, because back in 1916, the Olympics were postponed. Now, they weren't in 1920, so we're fudging the numbers here a little bit, but World War I canceled the 1916 Olympics, and the 2020 pandemic has postponed the current Olympics. It's actually the first time that that's happened because of anything other than war. And the Olympics are kind of a big deal because it's when the entire world comes together to do some sports. It has significant cultural meaning. But let's move on to the next checkmark, fear of revolution. In 1919, all the way into 1920, there was the Red Scare. Funny how many of these things I've already done episodes on, huh? But the Red Scare was fed by the idea that socialist revolutionaries were coming to the United States. Oh no! You had the chief of the Bureau of Investigation ordering a bunch of deportations and arrests simply on suspicion of being red. And there were a bunch of strikes and all kinds of craziness, all tainted with the fear of Bolsheviks invading America. And while 2020 is certainly not at that level, if you've watched anything covering folks like Bernie Sanders, you'd realize that there's an equal amount of that kind of red-baiting rhetoric going about. It's just not reinforced with violence.
And the Reds had won the Cold War. There were executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed. I don't know who Bernie supports over these years.
But then again, Bernie is not getting the nomination, and we'll get to how that's paralleled here too. But yeah, all this fear-mongering about socialist revolutionaries has redoubled itself in modern rhetoric. Just not as vitriolically, and it's actually kind of an American tradition to fearmonger about socialism. That goes all the way back to the 1850s. So let's just go to the next thing, a crime wave, because there was a bunch of lynchings and race riots and all kinds of stuff happening in 1919, and then there was another wave of crime in 1920 because of, well, something that we'll get to in just a second, prohibition. But in the United States, we're seeing quite the opposite of a crime wave. Because crime has actually gone significantly down over the last few decades, though there's a lot of arguments as to why there was a crime drop. In either case, it happened, and we are living in significantly more peaceful times. So let's go to the next check mark, and probably the most important for everyone watching, global pandemic. COVID-19 is scary enough to have the government shutting down pretty much everything, and ordering people to stay at home. And the same thing happened in 1918 and 1919 with the Spanish flu. But there are some significant differences between COVID-19 and Spanish flu. One, the death toll is not comparable at all. Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people. We haven't reached even 100,000 deaths with COVID-19. In fact, we're nowhere close while I'm recording this, and I'm guessing that by the time I release this episode, it still will be nowhere close to 100,000. So 100 million versus 100,000, it's literally orders of magnitude of difference. But part of why Spanish flu was so much worse was that we had no way of controlling the symptoms. A lot of people ended up dying of pneumonia, not the actual flu, because the pneumonia worked on a compromised immune system created by the flu, and people ended up basically drowning in their own lungs. But here's the thing, pneumonia is a bacteria, and we can treat bacterial infection now. We have penicillin and all the other types of antibacterial drugs. And then there's like respirators and other kinds of things of helping deal with the symptoms of COVID-19. Another major difference from 1918 is that we have epidemiology, which is the study of epidemics. And while that existed in 1918, it was a very rudimentary science. Nowadays, we can figure out where we need to close down and all that kind of stuff. That's why we have all of these closures so quickly when the numbers seem so low. Like, I'm having to create lectures from home. I attended a conference digitally, and VidCon is canceled, so I'm not going to that either. It all actually means a lot more work on my part, but maybe I'll turn those lectures into episodes one day. And I'm sure most people have these kinds of experiences. And that is the working of epidemiology. They're telling us we need to stay home. Or, as the president says it, social distancing! And there's one further difference from the 1918 flu. World War I isn't going on, so everybody isn't spreading it. We have the ability to shut down airports. We didn't have the ability to stop troops from coming home. So yeah, while it can seem a bit scary and there are people dying, this is nowhere close to as bad as the Spanish flu. So let's move on to the next check mark, which, admittedly, is kind of me just being a little silly. The worst amendment to the United States Constitution, the 18th, Prohibition, thereby making the 21st Amendment, which repealed it, the best amendment. Hear to the 21st Amendment. Obviously, we are not imposing prohibition, but what we are doing is closing bars. Most states have imposed bans on bars, or at least close gatherings, which bars entail. Suffice it to say, that has been a great blow to my morale. But when I had that list, I'm literally just saying closed bars, not actual prohibition. We are obviously not facing real prohibition. Luckily. Times would be far worse if we were. But alongside prohibition came the 19th Amendment just a few months later, and that was women's suffrage, which is basically the only constitutional right that women have, at least if you take the Constitution very literally. Even though it was proposed in 1924 and passed Congress in the 1970s, even though it wasn't ratified, the Equal Rights Amendment has never been a thing. So that's actually one of the ways that 1920 was kind of better. Women across the nation were allowed to vote for the first time, though many had already been voting in the West. So we haven't seen an expansion of women's rights in 2019 and 2020. So let's get to the most foreboding part of this list, and possibly the most unknown part. You see, in 1920 to 21, the US went into a depression. Now, most economists who study this thing think it was related to World War I. You know, all that spending doesn't come free. But there was also all that fear-mongering and strife just after the war as well, plus Spanish flu striked again in early 1919. So all those market forces combined meant that there was a huge drop in the market. and this meant that there was a huge amount of unemployment. Kind of similar to what we're experiencing in 2020. And that's kind of scary, because right now we're seeing a huge market drop. When I last calculated it, it was 35% drop in the Dow, except for suddenly we've had a huge turn. I'm recording this on a Friday, so yeah. The whole market situation is just all kinds of volatile, which is pretty much exactly what happened in 1920, except for right now it's even more volatile. And part of the unemployment surge in 1920 were all the soldiers coming back, whereas now it's all the people getting laid off because of coronavirus. Kind of the same thing when you think about it. It is a short-term job loss. But if this drop is a repetition compared to what happened in 1920, then we are not looking at the next couple of years as being very good. They're going to be possibly worse than 2008. And having lost a job in 2008 because of that recession, the idea of everything getting worse than that is kind of a scary thought. Like, unemployment right now is worse than it was in 2008. Though this is temporary compared to what happened in 2008, we are seeing unemployment levels at the rate that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And I really have no consolation here, because this could be something that the market bounces back, just like what happened in 1987, or this can lead to a depression, which we haven't been in since 1940. So most of us have no idea how bad a depression can get, and if 1920 is an indicator for 2020, we're bound for one.
But before the party comes a hangover.
It's called the Depression for a reason. But in 1920 there was another indicator that I am even more ambivalent about what that means, because it was an election year. The Republican candidate, Warren G. Harding, ran on a platform that said that he would return the nation to normalcy. Funny enough, even people then made fun of the fact that that was a made-up word. But the idea was that the Wilson administration had been just utterly crazy and really needed to just get back to good old market forces. So Harding kind of abandoned progressivism. But the Republican and Democratic parties are not the same as they were in 1920. And basically, the current Democrats are very similar to the 1920s Republicans. Since now that Joe Biden is basically assured the Democratic ticket, couldn't you see him running on a platform saying a return to normalcy? That seems pretty much exactly his MO. And Harding was known as the ladies' president. He was the first president to be elected after the 19th Amendment, and funny enough, in 1919, just before the election, he had just had an illegitimate child, so you know he was a ladies' man. Ha ha ha. Well, also, Biden seems the same kind of... Ugh. He's got sexual assault accusations and everybody makes fun of him for being a little too handsy. Harding was known as a heartthrob. I don't know where that comes from, so... Is Biden just a colorized version of Harding? So Biden is very much like Harding in the whole return to normalcy thing. He has been running specifically as somebody who can defeat Trump and bring politics back to normal. But that leads to the next question mark, an economic boom. Because that 1920 to 21 depression ended, though there is a lot of debate as to why. For instance, the Republicans raised tariffs, and they argue that's what saved the economy, protectionary tariffs, and that's still very much a Republican thing today. But in either case, if we do see an economic boom, that's what made the Roaring Twenties roaring. It was everybody was making money hand over fist. Well, obviously not everybody. So that would mean that the rest of the 2020s are really good. We just have a couple of years of strife ahead of us. So let's move on to the final check mark, new media. At the turn of the 20th century, a bunch of forms of media were in their infancy. Phonographs, radio, and movies all coming about, and starting to gain popularity. But after World War I, that's when they all exploded in popularity. Everyone could suddenly afford it. And along with these new media types came new genres. For instance, the rise of jazz. And all this came about from supplanting things like sheet music, plays, and vaudeville. So at the turn of the 20th century, you had the rise of a new type of media. And at the turn of the 21st century, we have the rise of a whole new media. The very platform this is on is new media. It's a brave new world of media, and we're seeing a bunch of new genres as a result. Now, there's not a clear dividing line like 1918, but it's something like 78% of Americans watch YouTube, so adoption is pretty high. So that's the end of the list. Let's go over a few takeaways that I can say for sure. First, no, this pandemic is not comparable to 1918. Nowhere close. 100,000 people is not 100 million people. Also, this president's negligence and malignance is definitely not comparable to Wilson's. Remember, hindsight is something that you have to gain steadily. And while a bunch of people are saying, this is the worst president ever, it's been trending on Twitter, for instance, no, nowhere close. You don't have a president openly fostering the KKK and ignoring the killing of thousands of people in the streets, or intervening to try to push democracy everywhere, while also very obviously favoring white countries to not kill people in. All the troubles we have now in terms of interventionism and the presidency being used as some sort of platform for hatred are pretty much legacies of Wilson. So which one's worse, the soldier or the general ordering the soldier to do bad things? That's basically the relationship between Wilson and Trump. Plus, we're at a point where global leaders are actually kind of less important than they were in 1920. We don't need to create another Treaty of Versailles. And when dealing with these kinds of emergencies, we can take decisive measures in ways that we couldn't in 1920. Heck, this current coronavirus probably wouldn't even be considered a threat in 1920. That's how far we've changed. We live in times of relative peace, and if we are bound for another depression, at least the US is taking proactive measures to counteract it. And best of all, we're not prohibiting alcohol, so we can drink our sorrows away. All of these things show that we're far better off than we were in 1920. But there are some foreboding things. For instance, we're not taking any significant steps towards progress like we did in 1919 with women's suffrage. It's been 28 years since the last constitutional amendment, and the Equal Rights Amendment is still nowhere close to being ratified. Yes, I know the arguments about indefinite ratification periods, but that's not actually how the law works. That would be unconstitutional to try to amend the Constitution through unconstitutional means. No, it would require Congress passing the ERA again and sending it out for ratification again, which is nowhere close to happening. Plus, we may be entering a depression for the first time since 1929. Ugh. And a return to normalcy is just a return to technocratic neoliberalism, the very thing that got us in this mess in the first place. So we're watching significant change right before our very eyes, aka history. And looking back to see how history might repeat itself is only a half measure, because, well, history doesn't repeat itself, even though it does have a tendency to rhyme. So history doesn't tell us what we should do, only what has been done before. And what may have worked then may not work now. So really, we can only study history to learn from our mistakes, to try to stop things from repeating that we don't want to repeat. After all, when looking back at 1920, hindsight is 2020. Oh, that's so dumb.